The first thing most people noticed about Myra Blackwell was the darkness she wore. Black lipstick, black lace gloves that ended just past her wrists, silver rings shaped like tiny skulls and moons. Her hair fell in waves of deep burgundy against pale skin, and she favored long skirts that whispered against the floor when she walked. She looked, to most casual observers, like someone who had stepped out of a Victorian morning portrait and found herself confused by fluorescent lighting. What most people did not notice about Myra was her hands. The way they moved with exceptional gentleness when handling fragile things. The way her fingers traced the spines of old books as if greeting old friends. The way she would pause, sometimes, mid-task, to straighten a crooked picture frame or brush dust from a forgotten corner that no one else would see. She worked at Hartley's Antique Emporium, a shop wedged between a dry cleaner and a failing phone repair store in a small strip mall that had seen better decades. The shop itself was a wonderland of forgotten things, grandfather clocks that still kept time, jewelry boxes that played melodies from composers long dead, furniture that had survived wars and relocations and generations of human lives. Myra loved it there, in theory. She loved the quiet hours when she could be alone with the objects, imagining their histories, wondering about the hands that had touched them before. What she did not love was everything else. Her co-workers, there were 3 of them who worked rotating shifts, had decided within her first week that Myra was a problem. Not an actual problem, not in any way that could be documented or addressed. She was punctual, careful, honest, and surprisingly knowledgeable about antiques for someone so young. No, the problem was something else entirely. The problem was that Myra was strange, and strange people, in certain environments, became targets. It started small, the way these things always do. Whispers that stopped when she entered a room. Schedules that somehow always left her working alone on the slowest, loneliest shifts. Comments made just loud enough to be heard but quiet enough to be denied. She probably does rituals in her basement, a Carler said once, examining her nails while Myra restocked a display case nearby. You know these goth types. Probably has a whole collection of creepy dolls. I heard she doesn't have any friends, Derek added. He was leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone without looking up. Literally none. My sister went to high school with her. Said she ate lunch in the library every single day for 4 years. That tracks, said Jessica, the 3rd member of their small trinity. She was the most subtle of the group, the one who smiled at Myra's face and saved her cruelest observations for when Myra's back was turned. Some people are just born wrong, you know? There's something missing in them. Myra heard all of it. She always heard all of it. But she had learned, long ago, that responding only made things worse. So she continued arranging the display case, her movements steady, her face carefully blank. Later, when she was alone, she would let herself feel it. But not here. Never here. She did not know, on that particular Thursday evening, that someone else was listening too. The man who entered Hartley's Antique Emporium at precisely 7 o'clock had been visiting the shop for nearly 3 months, always on Thursdays, always in the evening. He moved through the crowded aisles with a curious grace, pausing to examine pieces that most customers walked past without a second glance. A tarnished hand mirror. A brass compass with a cracked face. A small wooden box whose purpose had been forgotten generations ago. His name, though no one in the shop knew it, was Aldrich Vane. He was tall and lean, with features that seemed both timeless and difficult to remember precisely, the sort of face that slipped from memory like water through fingers. His hair was dark, threaded with silver at the temples, and his eyes were the color of winter twilight. He dressed simply but impeccably, in clothes that were clearly expensive but never ostentatious. What no one in the shop knew, what no one had known for a very long time, was what Aldrich Vane truly was. He had lived for 473 years. He had watched empires rise and crumble, had survived wars and plagues and the endless reinvention of human civilization. He had been, in various eras and under various names, a soldier, a scholar, a wanderer, and a king. The title was not metaphorical. Among his kind, the few who remained, scattered like autumn leaves across the modern world, he was still recognized as sovereign. The last of the vampire kings, they called him, though he had not sought that crown and had long ago stopped feeling worthy of it. He visited the antique shop because old things comforted him. Because the smell of aged wood and forgotten history reminded him of centuries when the world had been quieter, when darkness had been a sanctuary rather than something to fear. And because, over the past 3 months, he had become quietly fascinated by the strange girl who worked the Thursday evening shift. Not fascinated in the way humans sometimes meant when they used that word. He was far too old for such things, and she was far too young, and the very thought would have felt wrong to him in ways he could not fully articulate. No, his fascination was something else entirely. Something that had to do with the way she moved through the world, gently, carefully, as if she was afraid of disturbing anything. Something that had to do with the way she spoke to customers, with genuine warmth that received little warmth in return. Something that had to do with the sadness in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. Aldrich had learned, over nearly 5 centuries of existence, to pay attention to quiet things. And this girl, this Myra Blackwell, was the quietest thing he had encountered in a very long time. Tonight, he had arrived earlier than usual. He had not planned to, but some instinct, old and reliable, had nudged him toward the shop before the sun had fully set. He had been browsing the back corner when the other employees had started talking, and he had heard every word. Now he stood very still behind a tall armoire, watching Myra's reflection in an antique mirror, watching the way her hands trembled slightly as she arranged porcelain figurines, watching her compose her face into careful blankness. And something inside him, something that had been sleeping for a very long time, began to wake. The following Thursday, Aldrich arrived at his usual time to find the shop nearly empty. Only Myra was working, which was unusual. She was standing behind the counter, and even from the doorway, he could see that something was wrong. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Not from crying. She was clearly the type who did her crying in private, but from the effort of not crying. There was a tightness around her mouth, a brittleness in her posture, that spoke of someone barely holding herself together. He moved through the shop slowly, giving her time to compose herself, pretending to examine items he had already memorized weeks ago. When he finally approached the counter, he did so with deliberate gentleness. "Good evening," he said. His voice was low and calm, the sort of voice that did not demand anything. Myra looked up, startled out of her thoughts. "Oh, Mr. Vane." "I didn't," as she paused, smoothing her expression into something closer to professional neutrality. "Can I help you find something tonight?" "Perhaps." He set a small brass figurine on the counter, a sleeping cat, curled into a perfect circle. "I noticed this last week but wanted time to consider. Has anyone else expressed interest?" "No," Amira said, and something flickered in her eyes. "It's been here for almost 2 years. I don't think anyone besides me has ever even picked it up." "Then we share good taste." He slid the figurine toward her. "I'll take it." As she rang up the purchase, her movements careful and practiced, Aldrich allowed himself to study her more closely. There was a purple shadow beneath the edge of her sleeve, visible only when she reached for the receipt paper. A bruise, he realized, shaped like fingers. His expression did not change. But somewhere deep inside him, in the place where he kept his oldest and most dangerous instincts, something turned cold. "Miss Blackwell," he said quietly, as she handed him his purchase. "May I ask you something?" She blinked, surprised. "Of course." "Are you safe here?" The question hung between them like a held breath. Myra's composure wavered, just for a moment, before settling back into place. "I'm fine," she said. "Just a long week." Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. He had lived long enough to recognize a lie, and long enough to know when pushing would only make things worse. "If that changes," he said, "I hope you know that asking for help is not the same as being weak." Then he turned and walked out of the shop, leaving Myra standing behind the counter with a strange expression on her face, half confusion, half something that might have been hope. Things grew worse after that, as things often do when cruelty goes unchallenged. Carla, Derek, and Jessica seemed to sense that Myra was more fragile than usual, and fragility, to certain types of people, was an invitation. They started taking things from her locker. Small things at first, a book, a scarf, a packet of peppermint tea she kept for difficult days. Then larger things. Her wallet went missing one afternoon and reappeared 3 days later in the trash behind the building, emptied of cash but otherwise intact. "You should be more careful," Jessica said sweetly when Myra reported it to management. "Anyone could have wandered in. We really need better security." Management was sympathetic but unhelpful. There were no cameras, no witnesses, no proof. Myra learned to keep her valuables in her pockets. Then came the whisper campaign. Rumors started circulating that Myra had been seen doing strange things in the back room. Burning candles. Drawing symbols. talking to herself in languages no one recognized. None of it was true, but truth had very little to do with anything at this point. A few regular customers started avoiding her. One elderly woman asked specifically to be helped by someone normal. Myra said nothing. She kept her head down, did her work, and counted the hours until each shift ended. She thought about quitting, but she needed this job. Rent was due every month, and the job market was brutal, and starting over somewhere new seemed impossible when she could barely get through each day as it was. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late October. She was alone in the shop. She was always alone on Thursday evenings now, because the schedule had been arranged that way, when Derek and Jessica showed up together. They weren't supposed to be working. They weren't there to shop. "Hey, creep," Derek said, leaning against the counter with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We need to talk about your little rituals." "I don't know what you're talking about," Myra said quietly. "Don't lie." Jessica moved closer, blocking the path to the back room. "We've heard all about it. The candles, the weird chanting. Carla's been taking notes. We're going to report you to the owner." "For what?" Myra asked, and she was proud that her voice barely shook. "For made-up stories?" Derek's smile widened. "It's not about what's true, Myra. It's about what people believe. And people believe all kinds of things about girls like you." He reached across the counter, fast, and grabbed her wrist. His grip was tight enough to hurt. "Maybe," he said, "you should just quit. Save everyone the trouble. Because I promise you, things are only going to get worse." The bell above the door chimed. Aldrich stepped into the shop like a shadow given form. His expression was perfectly calm, almost serene, but there was something different about him tonight. Something that made the air in the room feel suddenly heavy, as if a storm was approaching from very far away. "Good evening," he said pleasantly. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Derek dropped Myra's wrist as if burned. He and Jessica turned toward the door, their expressions shifting rapidly from aggression to confusion to something that might have been unease. "Store's closed," Derek said. "The sign says open." Aldrich moved deeper into the shop, his footsteps silent on the creaking floor. "And I am a regular customer. Miss Blackwell can confirm." Myra's heart was pounding, but she nodded. "He's right. We're open." "Then I suppose I'll browse." Aldrich paused beside a display of antique mirrors, his gaze fixed on Derek's reflection. "Please, don't let me keep you from whatever urgent business brought you here." He glanced at an ornate clock on the wall, 8:30 in the evening. "When you're not scheduled to work." The unease in Derek's face deepened. "How do you know our schedules?" "I pay attention," Aldrich said mildly. "It's a habit I've developed over the years. For example, I've noticed that Miss Blackwell always works Thursday evenings alone." I've noticed that certain objects have gone missing from her locker. I've noticed the careful way she hides her bruises. His voice remained pleasant, conversational, but something in it made the temperature in the room seem to drop. I've noticed quite a lot, actually. Jessica took a step back. Look, I don't know who you are, but this is none of your business. You're right, Aldrich agreed. Ordinarily, it wouldn't be. I prefer to mind my own affairs. But you see, I've also noticed something else. I've noticed that Miss Blackwell is kind. Genuinely kind. The sort of kindness that asks for nothing in return. I've watched her spend 20 minutes helping a confused elderly man find a gift for his late wife's birthday, knowing he would never be able to buy anything. I've watched her rescue a spider from the stockroom and carry it outside rather than kill it. I've watched her greet every customer with patience and warmth, no matter how they've treated her the day before. He turned to face Derek and Jessica fully, and something shifted in his eyes. Just for a moment, just long enough to be noticed, they seemed to catch the light in a way that human eyes should not. Kindness like that is rare, he said quietly. In nearly 500 years of existence, I have found it to be the rarest thing of all. And I have very little tolerance for those who try to destroy it. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek's face had gone pale. Jessica's hands were trembling. Neither of them seemed capable of speech. I suggest, Aldrich continued, that you leave now. I suggest that you find other employment, somewhere far from here. I suggest that you never speak to Miss Blackwell again. Not a word, not a glance, not a whispered rumor behind her back. And I suggest that you remember this moment, the next time you're tempted to mistake gentleness for weakness. He smiled. It was a gentle smile, almost kind. Because I promise you, he said, I will remember it too. Derek and Jessica fled. There was no other word for it. They were simply gone, the door swinging shut behind them, the bell chiming once in their wake. Myra stood behind the counter, her entire body shaking. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Aldrich turned to her, and the strange intensity in his eyes faded, replaced by something softer. Something almost apologetic. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean to frighten you. You, Myra's voice cracked. What are you? It was the question he had been asked 1,000 times over the centuries, usually followed by screaming, or running, or worse. But Myra wasn't screaming. She wasn't running. She was just standing there, trembling slightly, looking at him with eyes that held more wonder than fear. Something very old, he said honestly. Something that should probably frighten you. But something that means you no harm whatsoever, if that helps. Myra considered this. The Vampire King, as she said slowly. From the stories. The old ones, not the movie ones. My grandmother used to tell me about, as she stopped, shaking her head. I thought they were just stories. Most true things become stories eventually. Aldrich moved to the counter, keeping a respectful distance between them. I've been visiting this shop for months. I should have intervened sooner. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place, that you were handling things, that getting involved would only make matters more complicated. He paused. I was wrong. And I'm sorry. Myra was quiet for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. It was a small, shaky laugh, edged with something that might have been relief. A vampire king, Ishi said. An actual vampire king has been coming to my antique shop for 3 months, and all this time I thought you were just a nice man with good taste in brass figurines. I do have good taste in brass figurines, Aldrich said mildly. The two things aren't mutually exclusive. Myra laughed again, harder this time, and then suddenly she was crying. Not dramatic, theatrical tears, but the quiet, exhausted tears of someone who had been holding everything together for far too long. Aldrich said nothing. He simply stood there, present and patient, while she wept. When the tears finally subsided, Myra wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm sorry, Ishi said. I don't know why I don't apologize. Aldrich pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, actual cloth, not paper, because some habits from earlier centuries were hard to break, and offered it to her. You've been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. It's natural to feel lighter when you finally set it down. Myra took the handkerchief. It was soft, old, embroidered with initials she didn't recognize. What happens now? Ishi asked quietly. Do I just go back to work? Pretend none of this happened? That depends on what you want. Aldrich leaned against the counter, his posture deliberately casual. If you want to stay here, I can ensure that you're not troubled again. Your former co-workers won't be returning, and I suspect management will suddenly discover that they have budget for better security and more reasonable scheduling. Oh, Myra asked. Or, Aldrich said, I could offer you something different. He gestured around the shop. I own several properties, including a small museum in the historical district. It specializes in items from the 18th and 19th centuries, furniture, jewelry, documents, that sort of thing. The current curator is retiring next month. The position involves cataloging, restoration, and occasionally dealing with customers who have more money than sense. The hours are reasonable, the pay is good, and I can promise you that no one there will make you feel unwelcome. Myra stared at him. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you an opportunity, Aldrich said. What you do with it is entirely your choice. You can stay here if you prefer. You can think about it for as long as you need. You can refuse entirely, and I'll never mention it again. I'm not trying to buy your gratitude or obligate you to anything. I'm simply trying to offer you something that has been in short supply in your life, a choice. Myra was quiet for a long time. She looked around the shop, at the cluttered shelves, the dusty corners, the flickering fluorescent lights that had given her headaches for 2 years. She thought about all the days she had spent here, surrounded by beautiful things and ugly treatment, telling herself that she should be grateful just to have a job at all. Then she looked back at Aldrich. At his patient eyes, his careful distance, his absolute refusal to pressure or demand. "Can I ask you something?" Ishi said. "Of course." "Why do you care?" "About me, I mean. You said you've been alive for almost 500 years. You're a king. You could be anywhere, doing anything. Why spend your Thursday evenings in a rundown antique shop, protecting a girl you barely know?" Aldrich was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Because I've lived long enough to understand what matters," he said finally. "Power doesn't matter." "Not really." "Crowns don't matter. Wealth, status, legacy, none of it matters. What matters is how we treat the people who cannot defend themselves. What matters is whether we use our strength to protect or to harm. What matters is the small kindnesses, the quiet choices, the moments when no one is watching." He paused, his gaze distant. "I've made mistakes," he continued. "In nearly 5 centuries, I've made terrible mistakes. I've been cruel when I could have been kind. I've been silent when I should have spoken. I've looked away from suffering because it was easier than getting involved. And every one of those choices diminished me in ways I'm still trying to repair." He looked back at Myra. "When I see someone like you, someone who has been treated badly but still chooses kindness, still chooses gentleness, still refuses to let the world make her hard, I see something worth protecting. Not because you're weak, but because you're rare. And rare things should be treasured, not destroyed." Myra felt tears threatening again, but these were different. Warmer. "The museum job," Ishi said. "Does it start next month?" Aldrich smiled. "It can start whenever you're ready." 1 year later, Myra stood in the restored gallery of the Vane Historical Collection, adjusting the placement of a Victorian mourning brooch in its display case. The museum had become her sanctuary, quiet rooms filled with beautiful things, visitors who appreciated her knowledge, colleagues who treated her with genuine respect. Aldrich visited often, though he was careful never to hover or make her feel obligated to entertain him. They had developed an easy friendship, built on shared appreciation for old things and comfortable silences. Sometimes they would spend entire afternoons discussing the provenance of a particular piece, or debating the historical accuracy of a restoration technique, or simply sitting together in the archive room while rain pattered against the windows. She had learned more about him over the months, fragments of his long history, glimpses of the weight he carried. She understood now that immortality was not a gift but a burden, that watching everyone you loved grow old and die while you remained unchanged was a loneliness beyond imagining. She understood that his title as king was not something he had sought, but something he had accepted because someone needed to guide his kind toward gentleness rather than violence. She understood, most of all, that his protection of her had not been about power or obligation. It had been about choice, the same choice he had offered her that night in the antique shop. The choice to be kind when cruelty would have been easier. The choice to protect when looking away would have been simpler. The choice to see someone's worth when everyone else saw only strangeness. One evening, as they were locking up the museum together, Myra paused at the door. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't think I've ever properly said it. Thank you for what you did. For everything you've done." Aldrich turned to her, his expression gentle. "You don't owe me thanks." "Maybe not," Amira said. "But I want to give it anyway. You saw me when no one else did. You stood between me and something that was destroying me. And you never asked for anything in return." "I got something in return," Aldrich said. "I got to watch you flourish. I got to see you become the person you were always capable of being, when you weren't spending all your energy just surviving. That's more than enough payment for anything I've done." Myra smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes, the kind that had been rare a year ago but came easily now. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked. Aldrich nodded. "Same time tomorrow." And as they walked out into the evening together, the ancient vampire king and the goth girl who had been so easy to underestimate, the fading sunlight caught the silver rings on her fingers, and neither of them felt alone at all.